Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us or your holiday. Joining me from the CCHN team, my colleague Ines Lalil, the Operation Associate for Europe, who will be leading the tech hosting for the webinar and moderate the Q&A with me later. As humanitarians, our primary focus is the needs of affected and vulnerable population, but access is never just a logistical matter. It's shaped by power dynamics, political agenda, and the broader geopolitical context. In many conflict-affected areas around the world, humanitarian negotiations are directly influenced by international interests and regional tensions. So today we will explore how these forces shape humanitarian space and why a clear understanding of geopolitics is crucial to protecting access and ensuring aid reaches those to the front line. To do this, we will focus on three critical contexts. First is Ukraine, where getting humanitarian aid to frontline and occupied areas is still extremely difficult, with the conflict ongoing and a lot of international attention and political pressure shaping the response. And then we go to Sudan, a rapidly worsening crisis where fighting has pushed more than half the population into urgent need of help, making it one of the biggest humanitarian emergencies in the world right now. And finally, the occupied Palestinian territories, where delivering aid means navigating highly politicized restriction and tough negotiations, especially in Gaza and the West Bank, where over more than 2 million people rely on assistance that often delayed or blocked. Our speakers will share their insights into the realities at the front line, discussing geopolitical impact on the victims of this conflict and the crucial work humanitarian actors are doing in the field, especially when it comes to humanitarian negotiations. For those of you who are less familiar with the CCHN, I'll give a brief introduction before we dive into today's discussion. But first, let's cover a few housekeeping items. Drop your questions anytime using the chat box. We encourage active participation, so feel free to use the chat to put your comments. When you write a question in the chat, kindly indicate the name of the speaker your question is addressed to. If it's a more general question, feel free to write that it's for all speakers. We'll take your questions at the end of the presentation from the speakers, so in the last more or less 30 minutes of the webinar. The webinar is recorded. It's for internal and learning purposes. We value the diverse perspective being shared by our speakers today as they reflect their own experiences and insights. They're contributing to a rich dialogue and offering us valuable opportunities for learning and reflection. So this session will be conducted only in English. Unfortunately, no simultaneous interpretation is available. And finally, we will share parts of the discussion on our social media in the weeks following this session. So the two objectives of the webinar, first is to present key insights on how power, politics, and geopolitical dynamics shape humanitarian access, drawing from cases in Sudan, Ukraine, and occupied and Palestinian territories, and explore effective negotiation strategies that humanitarian actors can use to navigate this complex political landscape and protect aid delivery in challenging environment. We will start with a brief introduction to the CCHN and our work supporting frontline humanitarian negotiators. Then we'll move into presentation from our speakers, Nataliya Gumenyuk and Anastasiya Marchuk on Ukraine, Professor Alex de Waal, and Martin Fisher on Sudan, and Helena Ranchal on the occupied Palestinian territories. So the CCHN is a joint initiative from the International Committee of the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières Switzerland, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the United Nations World Food Programme. It was founded in 2016. We offer a wide range of learning and sharing opportunities designed to meet the needs of humanitarian practitioners, senior managers, and agencies. We create this safe space and confidential space for humanitarian professionals to come together, exchange experiences, and develop their negotiation skills through hands-on, experience-based workshops. Most of the workshops that we do are available in different languages, multiple languages. But in addition to our workshop, we work closely with our community of practice to research, capture, and analyze current negotiation practices. And this helps us develop strategic tools for more effective negotiation in the field. We also provide tailored support to organizations that want to navigate negotiation deadlocks or who wish to strengthen the negotiation capacity of their staff. In 2025, the community of practice of the CCHNs brings together more than 8,000 humanitarian professionals from across the globe. Our work is guided by several thematic priorities, including protection, healthcare, community-led negotiation, humanitarian diplomacy, and more. These themes emerge directly from realities faced on the ground, and the goal is always to amplify the voices of those closest to the front line. So without taking more from the speaker's presentation, let me now introduce our first two speakers, both joining us from Ukraine. So Nataliya Gumenyuk is a Ukrainian journalist and author specializing in conflict reporting. She is the founder and CEO of the Public Interest Journalism Lab, which promotes constructive discussion around complex social issues. Nataliya regularly contributes to different press publications, and as a foreign news correspondent, she has reported from over 50 countries. Anastasiya Marchuk is the deputy head of mission at Nonviolent Peaceforce based in Odessa. She's a humanitarian with over 15 years of professional experience, from which she spent 8 years with the International Committee of the Red Cross. Anastasiya holds a Master of International Law and Armed Conflicts from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. Let me hand it over to you, Nataliya.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I really appreciate. And my time is working a bit earlier, and I'll try to also lay the ground for where we are currently and what is special about the Russian war against Ukraine and the humanitarian crisis it has been created. The war had started in 2014. In the time where there was no any humanitarian crisis. So it was created because of the war. And actually in the territories where you have rather two developed states, Russia and Ukraine, with no real emergency, no any humanitarian emergency. And since the very first start, the humanitarian aid has become one of the tools to wage the war. So, for instance, I would remind the part of Ukraine, Russia, and the eastern Ukraine has been occupied in early 2014, and then we can speak about 2022 full-scale invasion. In both cases, the toolkit is more or less the same, but access of the volunteers to the areas where there were military actions, either it would be the evacuation or bringing the military aid was highly restricted by the Russian forces. And in particular, at that time, Ukrainian government in some cases had the capabilities to deliver this aid, but it was also stopped. And this low intensity conflict has been lasting till 2022, where more or less even like paying the pensions to the people living in the occupied territories became the problem, especially in the Donbass. In case of Crimea, Russia was kind of using this whole support of providing pensions, paying people as also as a part of exercising their governance on those territory. And after 2022, when there was very intense actions, in particularly in all over the country, in particularly also close to the capital in the eastern Ukraine or in the southern, There was never access for any international humanitarian organization. There was no, but also we had also by that time developed a very large network of the Ukrainian humanitarian organization, individual volunteers who were capable. Also, by that time, there would be the volunteers from the churches, various churches in particular. So in all those cases, there was an opportunity to come, but in particularly people who were delivering those aid were targeted. So we have, I'm also working within the Reckoning project, which document war crimes, and we recorded a numbers of the targeted attack against volunteers who were evacuating people, but also those who were bringing any humanitarian aid could also be targeted for the detentions, and how we can also, after collecting hundreds of the testimonies and talking to the specialists, the lawyers specialized in international humanitarian law, they would also confirm that actually targeting the active individuals who are capable to help their communities, detaining them was the way to control the community. They shouldn't be there. And among, people whom we talk, documenting various kind of the war crimes, we even identify the specific group which is targeted: volunteers delivering humanitarian aid. I'm not even speaking about the representatives of the international organization. I'm not speaking now about international humanitarian workers, but I want to give the example that the members of the special monitoring mission of the OSCE, which was still was in action till 2022, they are still kept as hostages. I'm speaking about the Ukrainian nationalists. They are still in Luhansk. They are kind of charged with spying whatsoever, but they are there. So we can speak about this targeted attack on the whole humanitarian system. At the same time, something else to observe, because I just don't want to be focused on what Russia does. What for us is very critical, and I'm very glad to speak at this webinar where we can speak also about Southern Sudan, about Palestine. Of course, Ukraine is a functioning democratic state. It has the government, it has rescue services, Ministry of the Healthcare, and various other institutions, as well as functioning business. So, and as well, quite a few Ukrainian charities. What we also observed that obviously in different cases, either the Ukrainian charities or the Ukrainian state bodies, they are the first to be on the spot. And if we're speaking about for instance, the liberated territories, it's happening today very rare, but in 2022, there were a couple of large military operations when the Russian military forces withdrew from the northern Ukraine, from the east, from the south. In fact, when the city is liberated, the first people to come would be, of course, Ukrainian state, but also with the post office, with the deminers, but also they would be coming as a caravan, and they would be the first to deliver. And within this 3 years, also the state developed a number of the system where, for instance, the Ukrainian post office became kind of more or less a humanitarian organization. It's the organization which going and bringing the particular medicine to the elderly, cash when it's necessary. So it's one of the, let's say, a charitable humanitarian organization. And also, again, without undermining, international support, I need to stress that if we're speaking at less like say, the areas which are hot, which are dangerous, that would be probably Ukrainian state and big organization. If we're speaking about a particular very dangerous places, a particular villages, towns, there would be quite a lot of smaller humanitarian volunteer groups, including religious group, Protestants, who would risk their lives and still will do that. And when we speak about the big international organizations, they would come like 4 or 5 months later, and also without criticism, I should also say, due to the way how it's organized, the large international organizations usually would be based in western part Ukraine, close to the Polish border, and due to various security protocols, they would be rarely, operating further on the ground. What is actually happening that either Ukrainian state or the Ukrainian volunteer organization, humanitarian organization, would take what is necessary, mainly from the organizations like UNICEF, and would deliver it to the front lines. And I should also say that the funds from the international organization and foreign governments for the humanitarian operations are still remaining the biggest. Like they are pretty huge in supporting Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainians all over the place, but they are usually given through the infrastructural projects. Would it be, for instance, rebuilding the power grid, providing technical expertise, which would be done usually by the Ukrainian workers and local partners, or there would be something like building a school, building a hospital, but in a kind of area which is largely would be considered already, let's say, rather safe. And what was also in some point the concern from the Ukrainian charity organization, and I had also the chance to talk to a couple of them, it's this, also a kind of disproportion if we speak about the distribution of the financial means. By this, I mean that especially in year 2022, after the full-scale invasion, quite a few organizations emerge globally in Ukraine, which are also pan-regional organizations. So, for instance, there was no, in the areas where the war is ongoing since 2014, I'm speaking, for instance, about the Eastern Ukraine, there were quite developed organizations, there was some practice, there was also a kind of a tradition of the international organization at least having there some part of the staff. Most of them withdrew in January and February 2022 from the, let's say, areas in the Eastern Ukraine, in the south, which is closer to the Russian controlled territories. But in the areas like northern Kiev, Chernihiv region, Kharkiv, because there was never the war, there was never a humanitarian crisis, so there were always these smaller organizations. There was no this small organization. They all popped up more or less in 2022, and were financed through some of the donors, foundations, also quite a lot of Ukrainian donations, but also international. But what they started to observe that after a year after, quite a few bigger players, let's say like that, came to Ukraine, and the access to the funds, access to the grants was not really any longer there for a smaller Ukrainian organization. So the people who didn't work in the humanitarian sphere, especially connected to the distribution of the healthcare or the food or all this type of other kind of like a bigger projects, they were not really working in Ukraine till 2022, 2023, before 2022, mainly because Ukraine was not really that hot war zone. They came, and that's created a bit kind of tense relations between the national NGOs, but also a big Western, not just Western, but international organizations, which kind of funds were taken more or less away from the smaller Ukrainian organization. And the final point I want to say, of course, this withdrawal of the American support this January, it of course has a huge impact on the Ukrainian, on the civilians and on the humanitarian situation. There is no kind of a dire need, as I said. I've been myself, quite a lot of foreign journalists were asking me as a colleague, what should we cover? And they maybe were expecting kind of a refugee camps, or for instance, I don't know, people freezing, or people wanted to have food, whether it was an impact. In our case, most of those funds were given to these big infrastructural projects like fixing electricity power grid and things like that. So there is no like obvious change. You won't see all of a sudden, because of some of the project, this acute need, because in some cases European partners step up. However, in absolute numbers and for the whole process, for the whole war effort and for the whole effort to support civilians, to support their well-being, of course, it's one of the hugest. It has a huge, long-lasting impact. That would be all from me, and I'll be glad to answer any of the questions during the later interaction. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nataliya, and for this overview, and for sharing what's happening behind the headlines, especially the gaps in access in 2022, and how much local actors stepped up in Ukraine in these hard to reach areas, and also for sharing that maybe it's a time for reflection, that the international playbook doesn't work in every context, and rethinking how we work is always reassessing how we work, or how humanitarians operate is always a good point. So thank you for sharing these challenges with us. And now, with that context in mind, I would like to turn to Anastasiya, who's been navigating these challenges firsthand and can also share what it looks like on the ground with us.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here, and I will be reflecting on a lot of what Nataliya has been mentioning before me. Thanks a lot, Nataliya, for laying the foundation for all of this. For me, saying that the humanitarian work is separate from politics is just like saying that the state is separate from religion. Not always, not everywhere, more often no than yes. The recent events have shaken our world quite literally. The changes came abruptly, more brutally than expected, but yes, they were to be expected. The humanitarian field is suffering, and it's struggling at the margin of the global politics with the new world order about to emerge. Talking from the legal point of view, it's the sovereign states that are the only source of law in the present architecture. It's the states that willingly sign and take the responsibility to adhere to international conventions or not. It's the states that create and mandate a large majority of international organizations. After all, it's precisely the states that are the key donors funding the humanitarian work. So it's not really surprising in the end that the humanitarian work is a political animal, just as the rest, with all the consequences that follow. Unwillingly, no doubt, but we find ourselves forced to play by the rules. The impact that political developments have had on the humanitarian work is quite obvious. Taking the example of Ukraine, as Nataliya mentioned, when the full-scale invasion happened, there was almost unprecedented solidarity effort to support the country, including the humanitarian work on the ground. While this meant rapid expansion of aid here, other contexts with extreme humanitarian needs ended up being severely underfunded. Let's be honest, the humanitarian work is largely donor-driven. They get to tell us where to spend their funds, on which projects. They challenge our understanding of the context, with us being on the ground, and the programs to be developed. They fund us if we are aligned in our vision and principles. And as recently proven, they can take the funding away if their priorities change. Very much without a prior notice, without a proper phase out, not at all adhering to what we would call responsible partnership approach. And while for us, humanitarian workers, our fundamental principles are universal, we go where the needs are. We strive to alleviate the sufferings where we find them. For the political architecture, it's not at all that simple. The support is driven by political sympathies and affiliations, the outcomes of elections, other internal processes in the countries. Neutrality and impartiality are just not their language. But is it also true for humanity? And regrettably, it does seem so. Instead of practicing humanitarianism in all of its broadness, we see a world in which it's okay to choose whose sufferings to see and on whose to turn a blind eye. We are now observing the process of fragmentation of the world, and there is a clear strive for isolation and further militarization of the state, with the focus on security and protection of national interests. And this does not bode well for the people in need of help. While it's clear that the politics has great impact on the humanitarian world, do we do enough to influence the political realm in our turn? Are we still bold enough to talk about the things that really matter? My own observations tell me that the humanitarian space is rapidly shrinking. I see aggravation of violence against civilians, disrespect for international humanitarian law, which in its nature is just a minimum standard, not the end goal. Acceptance of grave violation as a normality. And with all of this going on, we also have less and less funds to respond to civilians' needs and to address their sufferings, even if we are being forced to give up on trying to prevent them. With the cuts in January 2025, the overwhelming majority of humanitarian organizations here lost a significant portion of their funding. They had to lay off their staff that they've built the capacity of. They had to readjust, minimize their programming, reassess the number of people they'd be able to support. The Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan, issued in January 2025, went through a reprioritization exercise in March, and not to match the realities on the ground, as they remain severe, but to align with the numbers in organizations' bank accounts. In the result, the majority of protection activities were deprioritized. The focus is on frontline regions with provision of critical life-saving services only. Well, the logic is clear, and so is the need for this kind of readjustment. With limited resources, we are forced to choose those who suffer the most in this particular moment. But we need to remain acutely aware that by failing to address broader and overarching needs of the displaced population, such as protection concerns, they will only continue aggravating. The premature returns of internally displaced persons to their places of origin in the front lines is a grave reality. Having not received any support after the evacuations, people go back to their destroyed towns and villages, as this is the only home that they have. And this is where they can still receive aid. The other big risk is the jeopardizing of the localization process in Ukraine. As Nataliya mentioned, with the local civil society organizations being widely recognized as the major first responders and key humanitarian actors, in particular in the most dangerous frontline areas, they're still struggling to receive direct funding. They remain the sub-grantees or implementing partners of INGOs. They are the central victims of the funding cuts. Having prioritized direct aid over fundraising strategies and donor relations, trusting their international partners, and often doing the work instead of them, they are currently fighting for the survival. And the price of their loss are human lives. And this is not a metaphor. I would like to close my speech by commemorating brave humanitarians around the world who are not giving up, whose faith in humanity leads them to the most dangerous and dire places, who choose to stay or to come from abroad to bring help and hope. So this is to Pavlo, my NP colleague, who chose humanitarian action, but was conscripted and died on the battlefield. To Oleg, the volunteer of the Ukrainian organization Spravzhny, who died in the result of a drone hit on a humanitarian vehicle in Kherson last Saturday. To the 15th
I'm sorry, we're losing Anastasiya. Let's just wait a bit to see if she's coming back. Anastasiya, I'm so sorry. We lost the very last minute, the very last few seconds.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The last thing I heard was Kherson. I don't know.
Right. So I just wanted to also commemorate the 15 first responders that were killed in Gaza and the relief workers who lost their lives in the Zamzam camp this week. And of course, many others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anastasiya. Sorry, we lost you for the last minutes. And thank you for being so transparent and honest as always, and shaking us with your reality, honesty and reality check, and reminding us that it's important to, in the humanitarian approach, to have a strategy, to see more long-term, to keep protection as a top priority in a context like Ukraine. Thanks for sharing your points, and thanks to both of you actually for grounding us in the Ukrainian context. And now we're going to shift our focus to Sudan. We're gonna continue the conversation with Professor Alex Deval, who's calling from Boston. Alex Deval is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation and the Fletcher School Tufts University, and he's the author of several influential works, including Mass Starvation, the History of and Future of Famine. Then we'll hear from Martin Fischer, calling from Budapest, who has over 22 years of experience with the Red Cross movement and OCHA, specializing in emergency response, civil-military coordination, and humanitarian access, mainly in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, MENA, and beyond. Martin recently spent 16 months in Sudan and is a long-time CCHN member, valuing its rigorous approach to negotiation. But first, let's hear from Professor Alex Deval. Over to you.
So thank you very much for inviting me to share some thoughts on this, and I'm looking forward to being able to engage in discussion. So let me give a bit of a historical context and overview to the challenges of humanitarian action in Sudan. And let me go back to the year when I first went to Sudan to work on these issues, which was 1984. And the reason I did so from my university, which was Oxford, was that the University of Khartoum, in association with Sudanese public sector workers, especially at the Commission of Refugees, were the world's innovators in research and in developing humanitarian studies and humanitarian principles and practice. So that, for example, that same year, 1984, it was the government of Sudan that brought to the UN General Assembly a resolution to redefine the mandate of UNHCR to include not just people who as individuals were seeking asylum based upon a well-founded fear of persecution, but also persons of concern to UNHCR who had not yet crossed that threshold, but who, through a combination of war and other forms of repression and out of desperation, needed assistance. So there was a very specific example of a humanitarian principle innovation coming from the global south, and actually coming from a combination of academics and public servants in a country. So Sudan was actually a pioneer in humanitarian principles, and it came from a combination of Sudanese humanitarian professionals at the vanguard and internationals joining. This was back in the 1980s. And there was also, similarly, in response, a reaction, a resistance, a repression by the Sudanese government at the highest level. So even while there was an attempt to enlarge the space for assistance and protection for refugees back in the 80s, there was also efforts by the government to restrict that space. And we've seen this struggle being played out over the 4 decades that I've been involved in this. So let me give a few examples which allow us to put the current crisis and response, and indeed the shortcomings of that response, in context. The first example was in southern Sudan in 1988, 1989. There was a terrible famine brought about deliberately by the use of starvation as a weapon of war by the then government of Sudan. There was an outcry in Sudan and internationally, which led to Operation Lifeline Sudan, launched in 1989. This was the first occasion on which the United Nations mounted a cross-line humanitarian assistance program into an area controlled by a non-governmental armed group. Up to then, they had never done that. They'd never done it in Biafra, never done it in Bangladesh, never done it in Cambodia, never done it anywhere in the world. Sudan was the first place. And as unfortunately, the war continued. So for some 16 years thereafter, the UN and humanitarian agencies, NGOs, were operating with an ongoing war. And of course, in an ongoing war, both belligerent parties were trying to appropriate and manipulate aid organizations, aid supplies, information, individuals for their own political, military, and economic benefit. In response to that, the UNICEF and others, especially in the NGO sector, developed a set of humanitarian principles, which became the kernel of what was then applied elsewhere in Africa and indeed elsewhere around the world. But even every time they were developed, there was there was an attempt to monitor and apply them, and indeed, to some extent, even enforce them with sanctions and pressures. There was an attempt by the governing authorities, both the government of Sudan and the insurgents, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, SPLA, to control and repress. And so we saw this tension unfolding. Meanwhile, in Sudanese civil society, there were pressures for political accountability, for exposing what was going on, and for calling to account the leaders. And although over time that the locus of initiative shifted from Sudanese to the internationals. And we saw this in the wake of the peace agreement that was signed in 2005, very belatedly. We saw the UN and the African Union and the international agencies then really taking the initiative with UN missions. So there have been no less than 4 UN peace missions in Sudan and South Sudan over the last 20 years or so. The UN mission in Sudan, the UN African Union mission in Darfur, which had a mandate of protecting civilians. There was a mission on the border between North and South, the UN the UN Interim Security Force for RBA, which also protected humanitarian workers, and the UN mission in South Sudan. And when the UN mission in South Sudan faced the outbreak of a civil war in South Sudan in 2013, it had to innovate as well, because many tens of thousands of people immediately under threat for their lives in South Sudan, civilians, fled to UN bases. These were UN peacekeeping bases. They were not set up for protecting or providing for IDPs. And the UN had to innovate a protection of civilians function for its peacekeepers, which again faced a pushback from the then independent government of South Sudan. We also faced another innovation, which was the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in 2008, charging the then president of Sudan with an array of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. An action that, while in principle welcomed by, I think, all humanitarians, led to this acute dilemma. How would the humanitarian organizations continue their operations, protect themselves and their staff, while the government of Sudan and its agents suspected them, in some cases with a degree of truth, suspected them of being witnesses for the prosecution. So a number were expelled at that time. So these were a number of the principles that were developed, pushed for and pushed against. Now, the current war began 2 years ago, earlier this week. And regrettably, the United Nations and the African Union, which had an enormous investment of norms, of principles, of institutions, of personnel in Sudan, they have this legitimacy and this legacy of taking principled leadership on these issues, I think has frankly failed to do so. They didn't use the normative, the social, the political capital that they had. There was UN Security Council Resolution 2417, which had been initiated by the Netherlands, which was passed unanimously by the UN Security Council on the topic of armed conflict and hunger, which places a number of clear obligations, not just on belligerent parties and on member states, but on the UN itself, on the UN Secretary General, on members of the Security Council to raise this issue. And this Security Council resolution was designed precisely with this kind of scenario in mind. It has not been utilized. And I think that is actually quite a shameful failure on the part of the UN as an organization. And that, I think, has been permissive of normative regression. So what that allowed was for the belligerent parties in Sudan, the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, to use their the political space that was opened by not enforcing, or not at least insisting on initiatives on these key principles. They used that space to use starvation as a weapon, to restrict the activities of the UN. And in the case of the Sudan Armed Forces, which are recognized by the United Nations as the legitimate government of Sudan, though fortunately the African Union, the League of Arab States, and many others don't recognize them. They don't even control the capital, though they are gaining control of the capital now. They were able to use that leverage to restrict humanitarian cross-border access, to control a number of key deployments. And in December of last year, when the UN's Humanitarian Information and Food Security System, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Famine Review Committee, determined that famine was occurring in parts of Sudan, the government of Sudan, or the UN recognized government, refused to recognize that and expelled them. My last point is that the situation has since worsened. Of course, there is the shutdown of USAID, and that is felt most immediately and keenly in the shutoff of humanitarian aid, of which more than 50% of the funds provided for immediate humanitarian aid in Sudan came from the US. That has all been suspended. Some of it, I'm sure, will be resumed, but probably not much. But perhaps equally importantly, the Americans' own humanitarian information system, FuseNet, the Famine Early Warning System Network, has been shut down. So there is no US independent, impartial, objective information available. This has been running for 40 years. It is now offline, perhaps indefinitely. And that prefigures an attempt to abandon objective criteria, however incomplete they may be, but an attempt to abandon objectivity for subjectivity and political calculus in allocating aid. And then the last point is the normative regression. At least under the previous administrations, even though there were double standards, the administrations, the Biden administration, even the first Trump administration, made an effort to claim that they were adhering to international humanitarian standards, international humanitarian law. We don't see that now. Indeed, there's even a certain public relish or enjoyment in the arbitrariness and the cruelty of enforcing aid cuts and directing aid in certain positions. That has not thus far translated into similar principles among other donors, but it does open that terrible door. And the some result of this is that frontline aid workers are left hanging in the front line to face these impossible dilemmas of dealing with extremely cruel, extremely unprincipled, belligerent actors without that political and principled cover from the international system. Thank you, and I will hand over to Martin to continue.
Many thanks, Alex, for your analysis and the rich historical background. It really helped us to to understand the present day's issues and also the dilemmas that humanitarians are facing. And on this, we're gonna share the floor to Martin, who can bring his experience in Sudan and how it reflected in the practice at the front line. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you to Alex for that reminder that the current situation in Sudan and humanitarian access to vulnerable communities in Sudan is not something that is facing new challenges now, but actually over the past 4 decades has been a very kind of difficult series of engagements to get that crucial access to those communities, but also for kind of highlighting that it's very timely that CCHN is bringing us together this afternoon for a conversation on how humanitarian assistance is very much part of that geopolitical framework, and that we are a part of a big political process, and that how we negotiate our access to reach those vulnerable communities very much does depend upon the whims and the changing picture at the geopolitical level. So it's very timely that we kind of, as frontline humanitarian workers, negotiators, work negotiating with authorities in Sudan, negotiating with community leaders, negotiating across the different spectrum, but that we are working in an environment where that political engagement, that political enabling that is so crucial, is at the moment in a period when it's not what we would want it to be. So I think we have to be mindful. And I'm going to, in the course of this speech today, I'm going to just give a few reminders about actually how that political environment, how that actually does kind of affect some of the negotiations that we were having in Sudan over the past 16 months. But I'd just like to kind of continue the point that Alex was making, and I think Tom Fletcher, the USG for Humanitarian Affairs, when he was addressing the Security Council last week, he in very blunt language, he said that on the watch of the members of the Security Council, they were actively supporting the debasement of international humanitarian law. If that is actually what is happening, this debasement, and meaning that civilians are being targeted, Sudan, but also equally in the other countries, Ukraine and OPT that we're talking about, if that is actually the case, IHL is a crucial part of how we as humanitarians reach to those affected populations, and how those vulnerable people access the services and the commodities that humanitarians bring, whether it's from national, local humanitarians or international organizations. If that debasement of IHL is happening and taking, that is a major way that the geopolitics is affecting our access to people on the ground. Let me just kind of also look at what access really means and some of the challenges that we face in Sudan. And again, our listeners will, if they're more familiar with the context in Ukraine or in OPT, these will be familiar. But let me start with one of the big things in Sudan: bureaucratic measures that are put in place by the authorities, by the administrations, to bring in humanitarian assistance into the country, be it commodities, to bring in the expertise which is needed through visas, allowing people to move around from one place to another, allowing that freedom of movement. In Sudan, over the past 2 years, but again, looking back over the past decades, this has been constantly a restriction which has been placed. And again, without high-level engagements through the United Nations, through the member states, to actually remind of the importance of allowing that assistance to come in through the most pragmatic means. That is a very difficult negotiation to have at a more operational level. If you don't have that political cover, then you are very much at the whim of dealing with operational actors, and that's a very difficult one. So political cover is essential. I think, again, points that the previous speakers have mentioned: misinformation and disinformation. The point that was made before about famine in Sudan, many criteria were met by the panel of experts, to say that famine was present in areas of Darfur. Again, the government was able, without a lot of pushback from the wider community, to be able to just ignore or to disregard that. Now, again, credible experts had presented this evidence, and the government was able to push back. So this in effect, if they had been able, if the famine had been declared, that would have then triggered other kind of responses, including opening up borders to allow assistance to come in. But again, there was efforts which were put to push the government, but it wasn't seen over the line. And the kind of other members of the community, there was no consensus. There was no kind of, this is a famine. This is, we have to kind of work together to actually. There was divisions at the political high levels, and that was then exploited to mean that inaction took place and people died as a result. Sanctions and again, various political actors and members of the parties in Sudan have been affected by sanctions over the previous years. What this does is creates a kind of many things. A lack of predictability is one thing. It also means that it is highly politicized. So who you can, as humanitarians, who you can engage in conversations on access with, who you can enter into contractual relationships with, who you can speak. That is always a period of kind of dilemma. You're always a bit of uncertainty, and it's exploited. So one side will say, well, you're not supposed to be speaking to them because this is giving legitimization. If you do this, then there might be some financial penalties. Again, engaging with people who are on terrorist lists so I think again that lack of predictability is very unsettling. Moving on to that predictability point, I'd just like to kind of also mention that it's a rich tapestry, an access negotiation around all of those things, whether it's negotiating for visas, negotiating for movement from place to place. It's a tapestry, and you as a frontline humanitarian negotiator will be talking to a local authority or looking to a community. That's the engagement you're having. But that is part of as I say, a rich tapestry. So that person is also talking to other people in the political, maybe at the government higher level. They're also talking to community leaders across borders or in different. So as we are in a very uncertain geopolitical picture at the moment, knowing who you are talking to gain access, who else is having influence, is having pressure, is having a say, that also is something which we as negotiators need to be mindful of, and how we are perceived in that picture, how that translates as well. Because and I think Alex mentioned, the UN agencies, when the government of Sudan said cross-border operations through Chad or from South Sudan were not acceptable to the government, the United Nations, they listened, and cross-border operations from Chad were suspended. For other organizations, part of the humanitarian community, NGOs, they continued to provide assistance cross-border because they felt that the humanitarian imperative legitimized that, but also the reaction from the government of Sudan to NGOs, there was a tolerance of that happening, whereas the UN felt that in their legal interpretation, if they were to move on and do that, then there wouldn't be that tolerance. So again, the whole geopolitical picture that very much influences how the actors at a local, at a national level, how they respond to the international, to the humanitarian actors, but also how they perceive each other. I'm going to just draw to a close at that point, but just to say that the three things that we need to kind of be mindful of in kind of staying within for humanitarian access, it is to be mindful that we are working in this very fraught political environment, and also to look for constants. So to make the engagements, the humanitarian principles, the IHL, we need to, this is our bedrock, this is our values, this is our interest is in seeing this prominent in the access negotiations. So we need to fall back and to rely upon this. But we also need to be very mindful of who we are talking to and understand their interests and their pressures. And as we negotiate, yes, we talk about the neutrality and impartiality, and yes, we talk about the responsibilities of IHL. But we also need to look at the geopolitical picture and the political, and tailor our messages, not compromise our messages and our access messages, but to tailor them to be understandable to the person that we are speaking to, recognizing that they are talking to many other people and are under pressure from many other people. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Martin. And I think there was a question in the chat for you. I think you answered the question at the end of your presentation when you said that it's important. It's very important to be mindful to who you talk to. Either they are local communities, local authorities, they in a very politicized environment. So thanks for sharing these very pragmatical experiences you have. And also this understanding of the bigger picture in the operations that you did in Sudan. So thanks a lot. And then to close this round of presentation, we're gonna go. We're gonna hear from Helena Ranchal. Helena is calling us from Paris. Helena was involved in humanitarian work since the late 90s, and with a wealth of experience in development and emergency programs. Her career with Médecins du Monde began in 1997 when she joined the organization as a health program manager in Albania. And at the beginning of 2021, she became the Director of International Operations for MDM France. So Helena will reflect on the operational and political challenges of working in the occupied Palestinian territories. Helena, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today and to talk a little bit about Gaza, because we are not going to begin here a competition between the crises, but without doubt, I can say that to intervene now in Gaza is the most difficult humanitarian theater nowadays all over the world. Is the perfect horrible storm, and I will illustrate with some examples. But in general, you have almost 2 million people in a very restricted area. Gaza Strip is 41 kilometers long, for between 6 and 12 kilometers wide, and all the borders right now, including the sea, they are controlled by the Israeli force. So after 18 months of war, after now more than 51,000 dead people, many of them children, after 165,000 injured people, many of them that they need medical evacuation to the other countries. The situation now is, as the UN Secretary General said the other day, is the worst moment in Gaza. So he's wrong. The worst moment in Gaza, it was not last week. The worst moment in Gaza is today, and it will be tomorrow, if you ask me tomorrow, and it will be after tomorrow, if you ask me on Sunday. Why? Because since the beginning of March, there is a completely blocus. Nothing is going on in Gaza. We are talking that in general, there are, since the beginning, since October 23, there are more than 400 humanitarian killed, more than 1,300 health staff killed, and just if we count from January, there are 61 humanitarian aid workers killed since January. The situation is with this blocus from the beginning of March. And with all the bombing very intense since the 18th of March, the situation is worse and worse. 90% of all the NGOs, they decide to reduce or to stop all the activities because the security conditions are not there. And we have to change every day. For us, for example, for Médecins du Monde, we have 125 colleagues inside Gaza, the people from Gaza, national staff. And so what I tell you about them is very representative of the population in Gaza. In general, all of them, they were forced displaced at least or in average 5 times in the last 18 months. All of them, they lose many people in the family. For example, one of our health staff 2 weeks ago, he lost 17 relatives the same day in the same bombing. Of course, to find food, to find water is very difficult. The prices increased a lot. For example, for the flour is 4 times the normal price. The gas for cooking is 3 times. So in that condition, it's very difficult. And in that situation, at the same time, we have 9,000 pallets of humanitarian aid waiting in the borders. This is the situation. For us, for example, we have trucks of drugs waiting in the borders, and at the same time, we are dealing with the fail of stock for the coming weeks. So, that is the situation of all the humanitarian working inside. We have to deal with every day with the security condition. For example, we had some of the clinics that we have to close because we have to evacuate. It's good to remember that 65% of Gaza is no-go area. So we have to move from one place to another. The security condition for the staff and for the population and the impact in the mental health is quite serious. We don't have enough food, we don't have enough electricity, we don't have the conditions to work. And it's because of that, yesterday, 12 of the main big NGOs working in Gaza, we signed a statement that is called, let us do our job, because for the moment, it's impossible. And this is not because logistical problem. I mean, it's because there is not political willing. So this is the condition of Gaza. So very, very, very difficult to operate now. If we talk about the responsibility of the international community, what we see is that there is a total disrespect of the international humanitarian law. With really severe implications for the delivery of the principal humanitarian actions. We have, for example, lack of pressure of some states, 50 states, United States, and to the parties of the conflict for a better respect of this international humanitarian law. For example, during Biden administration, he didn't push enough to the Israeli government, and even we face a double speech and hypocrisy, very important, because there was a plan to put this seaport in order to deliver some aid action. But I mean, the solution, it was very, very, very fast and very easy. Is the Israeli government allows to enter the trucks for all the borders that they control, it will be easy enough. We are not going to talk about this Trump administration that is giving a green light for mass forced displacements and for other horrible Rivera dreams, but okay. This is, if I talk about these third states, mainly US, that they are the only one for the moment that they have enough power to stop that and to push the Israeli government, but also we see that there is a lack of power and influence of other institutions, United Nations included, because they are also under attack of the UNRWA, but also about other third parts like the European Union, that because it's divided, European Union, and because you have this double standard. For example, if we talk about Ukraine, the situation is not the same about Palestine. So there is some influence of some European Union members in alliance with these local powers like Jordan, like Egypt, but for the moment there is not one reality for a real thing. So of course that the humanitarian, we are not going to say, we are not naive to say we are not political. Of course we are political, but we are not a political tool. And for the moment, I think Gaza is a very good example, one of the best examples to illustrate the politicization of the humanitarian aid. Because of the constraints, the ones that I told you, others in terms administrative one. So the solution is political, but there is not this willing to solve this. We are doing the best that we can, but it's not enough. I mean, to save lives must be a normal right without conditions. And the international humanitarian law is not a business to negotiate. It's like that. It's the rules of the war, and this is completely forbidden and forgotten by the Israeli government. So I'm sorry to close my intervention and at the end of this webinar, but really I don't have any positive point to finish. The only solution is a ceasefire fast and permanent, because again 6 weeks of pause of anything is not enough if you see the destruction of Gaza. The only thing is that I hope that today I'm talking to you about Gaza. I hope that in 1 year we don't have to talk like that about whole Palestine, West Bank included. So our obligation is again and again and again to ask for this ceasefire. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helena, for this presentation that looked over 18 months of war and blockade in Gaza. And thanks for reminding us that IHL is not something we bargain with, and that it must be respected at all times. Thanks to everyone, all the speakers for your presentation, for sharing your knowledge and experience during the webinar. I think your insights are very enriching and give us a lot to learn and to reflect on. So thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Please don't leave, not yet. We're just we have few questions that came for you. I'm gonna start maybe with one more general question that we receive. So whoever feels like answering, please go ahead. And I think it's a very actual question as well. The question is this one: how have shifts in U.S. foreign policy, including reduction in aid, impacted humanitarian operations or perceptions of Western support on the ground? Can we already think of an alternative to these funds in the future? Anyone would like to? I can give you a few seconds to reflect, but Helena, you're there and you seem ready to go. So please go. But if you want to add Alex, Anastasiya, Nataliya, and Martin, please go ahead.
Yes, of course, there is a huge impact. We are talking about just one donor that provides 52% of the total humanitarian aid. So it's a huge, but we have to remember that they are not the only one. I mean, they are the German one, the English, the French, the European Union in general. So they are not the only one. And again, we are not going to talk about the impact in the NGOs. We are talking about the impact in the health of the people. There is some studies, and some of the studies I can write you later the reference if you want. It's talking that just with the retreat of this and the reduction of the USAID, there is 106 deaths every hour. This is criminal. Of course, I'm going to talk about health, but I suppose other colleagues about education, etc., can do the same thing. We are talking that, for example, people that they were with HIV treatment, there is chronic treatment, is for life. They stop some of them because in some countries in Africa, for example, the people, the organization, sometimes the local one, that they are the most important in past, they don't have the treasure, for example, to continue the activity. So these people will reduce, or they will stop the treatment, and it means more contamination, more death. One important thing is not American first. All the pandemics, all the sickness, they don't know about borders. So if you have increase of the tuberculosis, of the paludism, of the HIV, etc., it will be a global health problem. There are already many studies to clarify, for example, the impact in the first 90 months, 90 days of this freeze of funding. For example, just in sexual and reproductive health, the impact is huge. We are talking that more than 12 million girls and women, they don't have access to anti-conceptive things. And so this is going to be translated in many in non-desirable pregnancies. And we know that one woman that wants to abort, to do an abortion, she will do it, but she's not going to do it in a safe way. So it means more and more death. This is the same for the vaccination, etc. So at the end, all the improvement in health in the last 20 years, we are going to lose a lot. And a lot of people, they are going to death because of that. But the most sad thing is that there are deaths that we can prevent in an easy way. So it's because of that I say it's a criminal decision because of the impact of the people.
Thank you, Helena. Anyone else who would like to? Alex, I see you, and please go ahead.
Let me make one point, which is that this cutoff is a very dark cloud. But there is a small silver lining, and the small silver lining is that the international aid system was in many ways very inefficient, very cumbersome, not terribly well suited to need, and politically vulnerable. We would not, I mean, perhaps I certainly speak for myself. I expect I speak for many colleagues if I say we would not have designed the system this way. So if you look at the case of Sudan, the overwhelming majority of the material support went into food and food convoys. And this is very inefficient. It is easily diverted or misappropriated by the warring parties. In Sudan today, by far the most efficient way of assisting people is through local committees. They're called emergency response rooms. And they are not well suited to filling out all the paperwork, the forms, and putting in project proposals and saying this is how they're going to do their work over the next 24 months, how they're going to report on it, etc. But they act, and they act in response to immediate need today. And if we are to reinvigorate the system, let us put the weight of our efforts on those local humanitarians and not on these huge, relatively speaking, huge international organizations. Let's make this humanitarian effort an exercise in empowerment and emancipation, and that will be much more effective and make it much more credible as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And I see Nataliya. Nataliya want to jump in on the localization of aid. It was also related to a question. Sorry, Nataliya. It was also related to another question in the chat. So please go ahead.
So, but I first would also can just, support what Helena speaks about, the criminal nature of support, of stopping some of the aid. And in particular, if we speak about the Palestine, which is clearly, it's not about like lack of the seminar is about politicization, and I think I cannot stress more that in case of the Palestine and Gaza, it's not about we don't have this aid. It's really there and it can be delivered, and that's what's making it's the most painful and outrageous, and of course we all a bit powerless feeling in that way, and therefore exactly in this case it's important to see we now speaking about the withdrawal of the American support, but in particular we didn't expect about much of the American support. If we speak about the Palestine, we also should speak also about the other players, and in our case I just cannot say that and just reconfirm that the support from also European partners, with all the due to respect, it's not coming there. It's not really substituting the emergency. We could think what would happen in February, but some of the things are literally happening. Some of the support is coming, but if we really now in moment of the end of the April, couple of months later, can we say that there was kind of a big rethinking and the gaps were filled? Not exactly the case, and I want to reiterate also the point of Alex, still to say that about the inefficiency, I think for me it was actually striking. For me it was striking because I'm foreign news correspondent and I covered the other wars, and I remember very well what was my kind of that's why the Ukraine is such a striking example for me. When I would be somewhere on the border with Syria, and you'll see the UN truck, for instance, or the Red Cross truck, and you see, like, oh, it's there, something is going on. But we clearly saw how, in case of Ukraine, many of those institutions are coming way too late, when it's already, you just really can compare exactly this efficiency, because you really know today, because we can compare how much this operation takes by the local partner and how long it can take by the international partner. That's why it's also the moment to rethink. I've just returned from Syria, had a chance to be there in Duma, in particular talking to the local activists who were showing that couple of tiny projects which were supported by a couple of the European governments still after the chemical attacks, after the bombardments, still under the previous regime, but they just ensure that most of those projects didn't really benefit the people, like they did. And like they were pointing out that's exactly what they wanted to show. And I saw a couple of the places with the foreign flags. I won't name the organization, but they really said that most of the things, even such a place like Syria, I saw were rebuilt by some of the local activists and organization. In this regard, I'll just again return to Palestine. The problem is there that we even like don't really, in there they are targets, and that's also the problem. So we are in this circle where we need to figure out a lot of things should be given to the local partners, but in some particular conflicts, in some particular territories, they are exactly the targets, and we need just to admit the humanitarian workers became the targets. And then something to yell very, very loud.
Is there still time to reflect on this as well?
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you very much, Nataliya. Please.
I very much agree with all the previous speakers. And, when you study IHL, there is often this question, how do you instigate that non-state armed groups follow IHL? Because they are not signatories to the conventions. What it is that makes IHL compelling to them? And the answer is always they want to be seen legitimate. So they want to be seen as those that follow the rules. So here we are finding ourselves in the world where the state don't want to be seen legitimate. They don't care. They don't care if they're seen barbaric for failing to comply with IHL. Some of them take pride in just saying that that's not the framework we follow anymore. And targeting of humanitarian workers across the world, that's the grave reality. In Ukraine, we have the duty of care package for the humanitarians, which includes the bulletproof vests, the ballistic helmets, in some cases, armored vehicles. And this is just to keep them safe and to allow them to go to the places where the needs are. And imagine the investment that's going into those assets. And this is just the bare protection of the humanitarians that are already protected by the law. It's a huge paradox, and we are not talking about it, which we should. I think that we need to be stronger advocates. We need to be better at this. And we also need to work a lot on proper localization, which comes with capacity building. For 3 years in Ukraine, the humanitarian organizations, local ones, were seen as the implementers, and no one was really working on helping them, streamlining the funds towards them to make sure that they can take over. And I completely agree, Alex, that funding of the huge international organizations, that's not the way forward. It has proven itself to be counter-efficient. They're eating up the funds that should go directly to the ground, but those partners on the ground, they also need the support. So what we do in Ukraine now, because it seems like a transition period currently, some of the funding is preserved, but we understand that it's going to be shrinking and shrinking. What we do is that we are encouraging our partners to build up and to take our place. Because only they know what their needs are, only they know how the assistance should be given and how to keep it sustainable. And also to unite, to go away from the competition in the humanitarian field to alliances, consortia, you name it, whatever the methodology is, but to make sure the voices are stronger if they're together. A single voice in a desert is just a single voice.
Thank you, Anastasiya, and thanks everyone. I had another question for I think for Anastasiya, you answered the question already. So I'm going to move to Martin, and then I have another question to Helena. Martin, someone asked if you can explain a bit more about what you mean by political cover in its relation to access. You know, when you spoke about we need to define the access, you spoke about political cover. Can you just say a few words about this, please?
Very much. I mean, as we said, access into certain areas, it's moving into areas where there's active conflict going on, or where it's control of that area by a certain party. So to get access into there, you need to have to negotiate that. Now, very often that will come from a high political level, maybe international, where there's the norms and the laws which kind of say that needs to be kind of then taken at a political, to get the political agreement of whoever controls that area. And then also, if it's a non-government controlled area, with the government, their reaction, and negotiate all of that at a political level to make sure this is acceptable. But that's not enough. That's what I mean about political coverage. Then it needs to come down to an operational level. Well, how do we actually do this? What's the kind of the engagements that how do we actually get into those areas, or the community access the assistance which is required? So that's at an operational level. What I was finding in many parts of Sudan, when we were wanting to negotiate access, we were talking at an operational level, and we were working on how to kind of do that. And that political kind of agreements, they were changing, they were being delayed, they were being withheld, they weren't, and the one political kind of engagement and agreement would then trigger a political level kind of reprisal from another party. So it was backwards and forwards there. And that meant the operational level was incredibly difficult. So what I meant by political coverage was you have to have that kind of everything agreed at this level, so that then you can then follow on into actually how we actually do this. Over.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. It was super interesting, actually. I have a last question for Helena. So we have a few minutes left. Helena, in light of the ongoing situation in Gaza, do you believe international humanitarian law can be effectively implemented and that those responsible for violations can be held accountable within our lifetime? What prospect do you see for justice?
And I think it will be the only optimism intervention from my side. Of course, I believe that it must be is going to be respect. I mean, when I listen some humanitarian people talking about this humanitarian law, international humanitarian law, it doesn't exist, it's a joke, etc. Sorry, it for me is like if I take one image, it's like to shoot the ambulance. We can't, as humanitarian, we can't say that. I mean, in Palestine, of course, we know that there is this respect. The big respect of an international humanitarian law, but we have to continue arguing to say that it must be respect, that there is rules to respect, etc. And this is our obligation. And of course, there is international courts that I hope they will judge the people responsible for not to do that. But of course, I believe it. But is the only life jacket that we have for the moment in the situation in Gaza, for example, even if it's due respect every day, every hour, it's important to gather all this information and to say, okay, there is mean one the respect of this international humanitarian law and to continue. But of course, I believe, and of course,